Um, and I'm with Full Circle Strategies, and joining me from Full Circle is Denisha Cotlone, Nia Buckley, and Kim Smoots. And you will hear from some of them throughout the evening. Um, I just want to say welcome, right? And it's been a long day, I'm sure, for many of you. And you may hear stuff in the background because it's home family time now, and so you will hear some randomness when I unmute and just go with it. To kick us off, I'm going to just first thank Houston in Action and just acknowledge this collaboration that we've been able to do. It's been very exciting to work with them and really engage in some local work here in the Houston area. We tend to work with people outside of Texas, so this feels like hard work to do it here, right here at home. And so we're grateful for Houston in Action's collaboration. I see Francis is also on the call. Hey, Francis. So I want to turn it over to Anna, who is our partner and our ally for tonight. And it's good to do to be presenting side by side with her. So I'll turn it over to you, Anna, so you can just remind us of the working principles.
Thank you so much, Kenya, and Full Circle. I am very humbled and grateful to be in virtual community with you today and learn from you. And the rest of our participants here today. So on behalf of Houston in Action, I want to welcome y'all to our second session of Dismantling Racism. Oscar, who was with you all last week, couldn't make it today, but I'm here to support. And as usual in our spaces with Houston in Action, we'd like to review our working principles that really give the foundation of how we show up when we are together in this collaborative. And so I'll read them out loud and hope that you can also read them on your own and that you can reflect on anyone that speaks to you. So I'll go ahead and read them. Freedom from discrimination, guaranteeing protection from all forms of discrimination, bias, and harassment when engaging in the work of the initiative. Inclusive decision-making, establishing inclusive decision-making bodies which have diverse representation across identity groups and power dynamics. Everyone has a voice, respecting every participant's voice and perspective. Accessibility, we're creating spaces and communications which are accessible to every participant. Engagement with community, engaging in ongoing dialogue with communities that the initiative serves in order to inform continuous improvement and accountability. Group goals over our own interests, which means that we prioritize the goals of the initiative over our own interests when we work together. Equity and systems level change, actively working to balance civic power by changing systems that affect civic participation among communities who have been historically marginalized because of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. And conflict resolution, committing to resolving initiative conflict through direct, honest communication rather than toxic non-confrontation. So with that, I'd like to now pass it on to Donisha from Full Circle that will talk about the community agreements.
Thank you, Anna, and hello, everyone. Glad to be here again with you all. So I'll just skim through this first column and then I'll hand it over to Nia to go over the remaining agreements. So we want to ensure we engage in active and deep listening. The Chinese character for the verb to listen contains 4 character pieces that we want to focus on. And these 4 elements include ear, eye, heart, and undivided attention. So we want to practice our own deep listening, observe the quality of listening going on during this training. Can you listen with your eyes and your heart as well as your ears? And can you give this training your undivided attention? Next, we have understand the value of discomfort and pay attention to defensiveness. As we continue to mention, and probably will mention multiple times today as well, this information can bring up a lot for a lot of people. And so we just want to make sure we're paying attention to uncomfort and feelings of defensiveness. Again, being uncomfortable is our biggest moment to learn something. So in that learning, we want to also be self-reflective, paying attention to our feelings and what's coming up for us as we continue this. And also being able to step up and step back. So being able to fully participate, but ensuring others have opportunity to speak and be heard, and try to practice WAIT, which stands for why am I talking? And we want to use our capture tools. So you can have your pen and paper if you're old school, or you could use your phone and your digital devices to take notes of what comes up for you during these sessions. And also confidentiality. We want this to be a safe and brave space for everyone. So we want to be respectful of everyone sharing their lived experiences and keep that information disclosed and in these sessions. And I'll pass it over to Nia.
Thank you, Donisha, and thank you for having me again, y'all. So just like last week, be committed to staying present. Try to be here when you notice yourself zooming off. I know it's 6 o'clock at night. We've had a long day. So just be mindful of that and bring yourself back. And then commitment to going deep, being vulnerable and taking risks. So like when we do our breakout sessions and things like that, please do more than just be surfacey, really like dig down deep and ask yourself and be vulnerable with your partner and in our spaces. Know that it's a safe space. We create this safe environment for y'all to share and be vulnerable. And so then expect and accept non-closure. Racism exists, white supremacy has existed before any of us were alive. We don't have all the answers. This isn't a quick fix, but we can do this work. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And trust the process. Trust that this journey trust the process, what the feelings, like Donisha said, you may have that come up. Know that you're not in danger. It's uncomfortable. And that's all. And Donisha, back to you.
Thank you, Nia. And so last session, we talked a lot about the history of racism in the United States. We talked a lot about deep listening, centering ourselves in this training. We did a culture and ethnicity exercise to get to know one another. And we also ended on some shared definitions, including defining what racism means as we share this time together, or what we're saying when we mention racism. And we can go to the next slide. In today's session, we'll discuss and introduce several frameworks intending to illustrate how racism works in multiple levels. And that includes, we'll talk about expressions of racism, we'll dig into institutional racism, which is very timely, seeing that we just got through a legislative session in Texas. And then we'll talk about the cycle of racially oppressive systems, the continuum of racism, and discuss what a racial justice framework looks like.
This is always so heavy. And it's just sometimes I look in the mirror and go, why have you been doing this for so many years? Because it's a huge lift to have to talk about this all the time. But I appreciate hearing, but let me back up. When you all share and I hear you talk about what came up in your discussions, it just reminds me of how important it is to keep talking about this and to keep lifting this up. Like, we got to keep doing this. And we also have to figure out how to take care of ourselves and pause and celebrate in the spirit of survivability, our own survivability. And so the next several slides is pretty content heavy, but I'm hoping that you all are interested in that the information we share will be useful. And for some of you, it will be new information, and for others, it may validate or confirm things that you already know and things that you already experience. And that is okay. We are all in different places with this, with the ultimate goal being, so now what do we do with this information, right? And so hopefully as we get toward the end and move into tomorrow's dialogue sessions, some of that will start to bubble up for people. So I want to just start off the conversation by introducing the first framework, which is the 3 expressions of racism. And each one of these expressions will unpack a little bit more as we move and advance through the slides. And it is timely that we're having this conversation, right? Yesterday, commemorating a century since the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, which is just one example of probably more than 24 other types of burnings of communities of color, right? And then also thinking about just where we were this time last year, right? And I can remember hardly anybody naming the concept systemic racism. Like, you only heard that used in very small, specific circles. You just didn't hear it on the news. You didn't hear athletes talking about it. You didn't hear Nike owners talk like, and now everybody's using like systemic racism, right? And so let's get into it and let's talk a little bit about what we're talking about here. So this chart that you're seeing in front of you shows how institutional policies and practices reinforce individual acts and how cultural beliefs, norms reinforce institutional policies and practices. And so these things sort of work hand in hand together. There is no one siloing experience. There are individual acts of racism that people encounter and experience. There is the cultural experience, and then there is the institution, the organizational settings. So just to start with the personal, these are ways in which we perpetuate or assume the idea that white people are inherently better and BIPOC communities and people of color are inherently inferior on an individual basis. The ways in which white people act out racist implicit bias or explicit bias include and run the gamut of verbal expression of racism all the way to ways in which we may act and interact with people out in public, right, in a public setting. I grew up in a very Midwest town and community, and it was nothing to be checking out at the grocery store and have the checker not want to touch your hand when they give you the change back. They would just lay it on the belt for you to pick it up and grab it, right? Like just little random things like that, right? Or if you're walking behind someone and, you know, it's usually customary that you extend the door and let them, well, now that COVID is here, we probably, I don't know what we're doing, but pre-COVID, we would extend the door and and you hold the door and the next person grabbed the door. And there would be plenty of times when they would just let the door fly in your face, right? And so thinking about what happens at that very micro sort of individual exchange between two people. You're walking down the street and someone crosses the street because for whatever reason, right? We can only assume that it's because of who you are, the color of your skin, or who they perceive you to be, right? And so that is what we mean when we talk about personal and individual acts of racism. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that from both the perspective of white folks and the perspective of folks of color. Cultural is a very, this is a very interesting expression because the cultural racism seeps through in ways that sometimes we don't even notice and we don't even recognize, right? The ways in which the dominant culture is founded upon and then defines and shapes norms, values, beliefs, and standards. And I want to emphasize norms, values, beliefs, and standards, because oftentimes we believe that our family has raised us, our churches or our places of worship or our, faith spaces, in other places have instilled these values and beliefs and what we think about ourselves and what we think about others. But oftentimes those values and beliefs are attached to aspects of stereotyping, assumptions, and racism, right? And so the ways in which the dominant culture defines reality to advantage white people and oppress BIPOC communities and people. The norms, the values, and standards are assumed by the dominant society that perpetuate racism. So when we think about what is beautiful, right? Who is beautiful? What beauty is? Like, what is our standard of beauty in the United States culture? When we say someone, oh, she's drop dead gorgeous, what physical attributes come to mind, right? And that may not be for everybody, but when we think about it from a commercial standpoint, a Hollywood standpoint, or whatever type of image, right? Who should be the homecoming queen? The boy next door, right? We have all of these ways in which we talk about people that ascribe worth to them or that devalue them based on the way we're using that language, right? I remember in my early 20s, there's a woman, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with her. Her name is Peggy McIntosh, and she's a gender study. Actually, that was her work. Her life work was in gender study and studying sexism. But in the process of her trying to talk about and get the men at Wesleyan College to understand male privilege, she had this aha moment, right? The light bulb went off for her. And she was like, hold on. As I'm trying to sit here and name off all the ways in which men have privilege over women, why have I not put that together with race? Why have I not seen that before now? And so what she ultimately ended up doing was writing what has now become a historical document called Unpacking the White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of White Privilege. And I first saw that article in my early 20s. And I remember one of the things on that list was flesh colored Band-Aids, right? And so when we say flesh colored Band-Aids, the assumption is that there is a norm of what flesh should look like, but it may not match everybody, right? And so that's an example of these, that cultural piece, right? And so when we think about cartoons that we've watched growing up, right? Or the names of these sports teams, there are so many different ways in which we propagate and push cultural racism that almost feels normal to people. So if we're saying we should no longer call the Texas Rangers, and people are pissed off and they lighten up Twitter and, oh, this has got to stop, this is getting out of hand. That's an example of like stuff is disseminated through our culture. So it's so pervasive that we think of it as normal. We totally think it's normal that a white person is in charge of a company. We totally think it's normal that if we walked into a building and you saw the board of directors, and you wouldn't think twice if you saw them up on a wall and they all were white. But if you walked into a foyer of a skyscraper building in an urban area, and every single person on that board of directors was a person of color, you would do a double take. You would go, wait, what? Who are these people up on the wall? Oh, this is the owner. Oh, this is the vice president of marketing, right? Because culturally, we have been taught these different expectations. And I'll get more into that in a couple of slides. And then there's the structural and the institutional aspect of how racism is expressed, right? The ways in which the structures, systems, policies, procedures of institutions in the US are founded upon and then promote, reproduce, and perpetuate advantages for white people and the oppression of BIPOC communities and people. The ways in which institutions legislate and structure reality to advantage white people and oppress BIPOC communities and people, right? And so when we're thinking about institutions, which we'll say more in the next slide, when we say institutions, we're thinking about housing, government, education, media, business, healthcare, criminal justice, employment, labor, politics, church, or religious entities. They all perpetuate racism, right? So an example might be BIPOC communities and people underrepresented and misrepresented on television, racially biased standardized tests used to determine who will be admitted to higher education programs and institutions, right? For example, SAT tests, right, and ACT and GREs and all these different tests that students stress out over and have to take, are typically culturally biased tests. But for some institutions, they're so rooted and what they deem worthy, right? Like this is how else are we going to admit students? We have to judge them based on these arbitrary test scores, right? And that's an institutional issue, right? Because that's a policy, right? And so thinking about where the policies show up, and where new policies are attempting to show up. I think Nia mentioned this, or Denisha mentioned this earlier, like we just came out of legislative session where there was a boatload of ridiculous bills. Some are going to become law, some were not able to become law, that perpetuate institutional racism, right? Epitomize what institutional racism is. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, because this slide kind of gives us a chance to unpack a little bit more on institutional racism. And so we use the symbol of the pyramid for a specific reason, right? And so if you're not familiar with this background or this context, the pyramid sort of represent the structure of how power is distributed in an institution. So if you look at the very top of the pyramid, it's a very small space, right? And so that very top of the pyramid is typically where power is concentrated, and it's typically reflective of white men, right? And as you move toward the bottom of the pyramid, it gets broader, and that's more reflective of the diversity, different groups of people, different lived experiences that may or may not be reflective of what's happening at that very highest power structure, right? And so I'll turn it over to Nia, who will share a little bit more about institutional racism.
Thank you, Kenya. So like Kenya described in the diagram, the top is where white folks dominate and the lower part represents a more diverse folks. And so I'd like to share more in-depth points about these institutions. So for instance, in housing, for centuries, institutional racism in the US housing system has contributed to stark, persistent racial disparities in wealth and financial well-being, especially between Black and white households. In fact, these differences are so entrenched that if current trends continue, it could take up to 200 years for the average Black family to accumulate the same amount of wealth as its white counterparts. Please understand that since this nation's inception, race has been used to systemically exclude, marginalize, exploit, and generate unequal economic outcomes, while also being used to justify and normalize those unequal outcomes. US institutions are failing BIPOC communities. The median household income gap between Black and white folks was $30,000 in 2020. Worse than in 1960, it was only 25%. And apparently we were supposed to be getting better, right? And like Kenya noted, this year, 2021, marked 100 years since the 1921 massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where mobs of white folks unleashed violence against the city's Black community, Black institutions, and Black wealth. An estimated 300 people were killed and approximately 35 acres of commercial and residential property within the Greenwood district, which is known as Black Wall Street, was destroyed. And still in 2021, truths are still being revealed because of the whitewashing of this history. According to the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, the financial impact of the massacre was about $200 million, and that was as of the year 2018. And I just saw something as of yesterday, the Biden administration announced new actions about narrowing the racial wealth gap and rebuilding Black wealth. And so another point is within the education system, there is the erasure of Black and Latinx students by white teachers. And we can see it here in Houston. There are notable differences in the way Black students are treated by teachers and school administrators, research has shown that compared with white students, Black and Latinx students are more likely to be suspended or expelled and less likely to be placed in gifted programs and subject to lower expectations from teachers. So now I'll discuss the faces of power. 80% of people in power are white men, even as the US becomes more diverse, according to the New York Times article, Powerful People Race. The most powerful people in the United States pass our laws, run Hollywood studios, and head the most prestigious universities. They own pro sports teams and determine who goes to jail and who goes to war. A review by the New York Times of more than 900 officials and executives in prominent positions found that 20% identify as Black, Latinx, Asian, Native American, multiracial, or otherwise a person of color. So that makes about 40% of Americans identify with one of those groups. Even where there have been signs of progress, greater diversity has not always translated to more equal treatment. Of the people at the top of the 25 highest value companies, 6 are Asian or Black. Fewer than a quarter of the most valuable public companies are run by BIPOC folks, and Black leaders are becoming less represented in these roles. 15 people head direct major news organizations. 3 are Black or Latinx. News industry is spread across a range of media. These are the top editors of the 6 newspapers with the largest circulations and 3 major broadcast networks. The 3 big cable news channels and the websites with the most monthly visitors. The 5 people who have the most influence over book publishing are all white. The heads of the so-called big 5 publishers shape literacy culture, and are responsible for a vast majority of best-selling books. The people who edit the 10 most read magazines are all white. So that's where we get this, you see magazines and it's white folks everywhere. When you have people who are editors and they all white, what you expect. Collectively, the publications with the largest print and digital audience reach hundreds or millions of readers a month. 14 people influence most of the music that is produced and played. 2 are Black or Latinx. For an industry that owes much of its fortunes to Black artists, there are few executives of colors in the top rank. There are the chief executives who run the major label conglomerates that account for roughly 3/4 of the market, the 3 publishers that generate the most revenue, and 2 concert promoters that put on most shows, plus the heads of the 6 major streaming services and broadcasters. 25 people run the top TV networks and Hollywood studios. 3 are Black or Latinx. The heads of the 5 biggest movie studios by box office sales, 5 streaming services with the largest budgets, 5 television studios with the most shows in production, and 5 cable channels and 4 broadcast networks with the highest ratings reflect a trend that pervades Hollywood. White actors dominate screens, and white actors and writers are overrepresented behind the camera. Of people in charge of the 25 highest value fashion companies, 3 or 8 are Asian or Latinx. From luxury brands to department stores, the leadership of fashion brands doesn't reflect their customer base. 99 people own professional baseball, basketball, and football teams. 6 are Asian, Black, or Latinx. The principal owners of the teams in the country's 3 biggest sports leagues are also overwhelmingly white men, even though a majority of players in the NFL and NBA are folks of color. Some players have even questioned the use of the word owner because of the slavery connotation. And so that was just kind of like a gist of how power, institutional racism is played out through these power structures and institutions. Donisha will talk more about the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Nia. So for criminal justice systems, there are 2.2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails. And 5%, 500% increase over the last 40 years. Changes in law and policy, not changes in not changes in crime rates, explain most of this increase. Today, there are more people behind bars for a drug offense than the number of people who were in prison or in jail for any crime in 1980. Sentencing policies, implicit racial biases, and socioeconomic inequity contribute to this racial disparities at every level on the criminal justice system. Even in Texas, and the different movements in Harris County for bail reform, which is where the saying comes, it's better to be guilty and rich than poor and innocent, because our current bail system allows for individuals who are poor to be criminalized. It basically makes it a crime to be poor here in the United States. And today, people of color make up to 37% of the US population, but 67% of the prison population. Overall, African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, they are more likely to face a stiff and harsh sentence. Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and Latinx men are more than twice as likely, to be incarcerated than non-Latinx white men. It begins with the classroom and the prison pipeline, including early childhood classrooms, as Kenya and Nia talked about, where BIPOC kids are disproportionately targeted with harsh discipline, expulsion, than their white counterparts. And this is according to decades and decades of data. In Colorado, actually, Black students are 3.3 times more likely to be disciplined than white kids, often their first experience with the police. So this trickles down from elementary school. A lot of BIPOC students are basically measured on how likely they are to go to prison at a very young age in our current educational system, which again continues to perpetuate white supremacy and the racism in our institutions. And we can go over to the next slide. Looking at the data from COVID, we see that a lot of BIPOC communities have higher rates of underlying health conditions. That includes diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and many others that are known as risk factors for severe illness and death of COVID-19. Even here in Houston, the Acres Homes and Fifth Ward area have the highest rates of asthma in Texas. And so very, very severe illnesses that cause a more stronger hit for COVID-19, predominantly in those particular areas, which are predominantly Black and Latinx areas. These disparities can be traced back largely to the racism and redlining that have resulted in poor, overcrowded housing and exposed people of color to more severe levels of air pollution, factors that exacerbate all the health problems. When I previously worked in the Acres Homes area for a state representative in that area, and this is an issue in many areas where there's a lot of factories that land in these areas, including concrete batch plants that continue to harm these communities and the air quality in these areas. In Houston, we noticed that higher rates in Fifth Ward, Acres Home, South Houston, and other predominantly Black and brown communities that have more severe air pollution levels due to, again, concrete batch plants and big factories. The analysis by Washington, D.C., based on the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, found that 37% of U.S. households reported they sometimes or often had not enough to eat during 2019. Meanwhile, in the most recent census data, at the end of August of last year, 2020, showed that 10% of households say sometimes or often did not have enough to eat within the past 7 days. The levels of food insecurity in Black and Latinx households are significantly higher at 19% and 17%, respectively, compared to the 7% of white households who had this food insecurity during COVID-19. And we can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Denisha. So I just, as you are listening and thinking about how racism shows up in our institutions here locally, regionally, and then nationally, just keep in mind that there are many elements that keep and perpetuates institutional racism, right? And what are those elements and where does that come from? Because when we say institutional racism, it almost alleviates one of us of naming a person. Like we never name people, right? When we say institutional racism, we just say, oh, institutional racism has got to stop. But when we start to unpack that and we start to really think and have deliberate conversations about, well, what does that actually look like? We have to come to some conclusions about who to change and what to change, right? And so just be thinking about that. We want to stop the presentation and share a video. It just gives you a glimpse on how systemic racism works in institutions like housing and education.
Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university. the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So I put an author, this book was recommended to me a few years back, and I finally got a chance to get it and get my hands on it. And because I'm not a Houstonian, in every city I go to, I'm like, where are the people of color at? What's their story? What happened? What happened here? What happened in this community? That's me everywhere I go. I did the same thing in Las Vegas. And so this book, I have just been, it takes me away, right? And because it really helps you really understand how institutional racism benefits whites over folks of color and communities of color, policies and laws simply around how people get financed for homes, how people get rented to, whether or not they're going to be, apartments will be rented to them. What happens when folks move into certain communities and what happens to those schools that are in those communities, right? As the color starts to change of that community, which we know Houston, like many other urban areas, or I laugh when I call Houston urban because it doesn't seem urban to me. It still seems kind of townish, but the change in demographic and in the residential boundaries, right? And I'm reading a similar book, like parallel, in history of St. Louis. One of the things I wanted to lift up before we moved on with the presentation is around the cultural racism piece. And I remember, so we had a slide up, and then when Denisha was talking about criminal justice, it has a stat on Nevada. And it is Nevada has, it has a huge Latinx population. It has grown significantly over the last several decades, but the Black community is still very small. And so one of the things that kept happening, and this is cultural racism, right? There is a very small community called West Side, and it's west of the Strip. And that's where like a lot of the Black folks live. And oddly enough, coincidentally enough, a lot of them were migrants from Texas and Louisiana. So they had that like real Southern connection, right? In this particular community, which has its problems just like any other poor urban community, right? Crime would happen, things would happen, whatever, right? Nothing new. What was very interesting with the local media is every time a crime happened in another part of the valley, when they would report on a crime, let's say 20 miles on the other side of the Strip, they would use the image of West Las Vegas to lead their story. So every time you saw the story about a crime that happened on another part, that's just be like, we're looking at a crime that happened in Northwest Houston, but y'all gonna use the 3rd Ward as your backdrop, or the 5th Ward as your backdrop. Every single time. every single time. And so people are like, oh, I'm so scared to go to the West Side. Oh, it's so crazy on the West Side. And really, actually, crime had decreased in that community, right? And had picked up in other areas. But so that's an example of how these things sort of work, right? So you have on one hand a media institution that is very deliberate about the images they portray, right? To this day, they're still very deliberate about how they tell stories and how they share information. And if a crime has occurred, how they criminalize people in the media based on who they are in the neighborhoods that they come from, or how they romanticize people, right? Based on who they are and where they come from, right? And where they lead a story with a mother of three, who worked hard, versus a questionable, I don't know, like the random things that they may describe a BIPOC person. So just wanted to throw that out because I think it is very clear that institutions do not work independently. It is very much a shared set of beliefs and practices about who has power and who has worth and who. But people are hurt by these experiences. So let's bring up the next slide because I want to unpack the cycle of racially oppressive systems because that gives us an opportunity to really think about this as a cycle and how at an individual level the things that we may be experiencing, right? And so we present it as a cycle because it's really important to illustrate that this starts at the beginning of one's life here in US culture and even in cultures abroad, right? It's not just unique to the United States. And so there's this learned behavior that we all experience, and then it's reinforced in our adulthood. And then it just continues to repeat itself, especially for those of us who choose to have families, right? Because racism exists at every level in our society, it's not too difficult to imagine how it impacts our lived experience. Nia mentioned cultural racism and institutional examples of institutional racism and how they go hand in hand, and images, stereotypes, and assumptions that we hold. But I want to unpack a little more this illustration of this cycle. I want to point out first that for both white people and folks of color, we all have direct experience with this cycle, right? Racism is internalized by both white people and people of color. I want to be very clear about that. This is not just about talking about how it has hurt one group. This has been hurtful to everybody involved, right? And some more so than others, absolutely. Some more traumatizing and more severe. But if you are walking around and you're thinking, oh, I need to learn more about the history of racism. I never thought about it before. I'm telling you, it has been internalized in you too, even if you've never thought about it before. It has been there and it has been present. When you are exposed to a set of experiences as a part of your upbringing, you often are not fully aware of that process. The internalization of racism is the idea of buying into negative beliefs, behaviors, and ideas that without questioning the origin of where this information has come from. Unfortunately, these are often negative experiences that either causes you to disregard your own self-worth or the worth of others who do not look like you, and you never think to question that, right? And so to slow it down a little bit, for many folks of color, right, we tend to internalize those stereotypes, right? It's not by choice. It's not because we want to. It's not because that's all we got, like, right? It has been seeped and ingrained. And it shows up in every way that we have been taught, inside and outside of our households, right? And so from a white person's perspective, we have internalized this idea that that white folks' experiences and the norms and the things that they hold dear is the only way, right? And the only important or real perspective. Been taught that, right? And internalize and hold on to those beliefs and goals. So how does this happen? Is it random that these things happen? No. The idea of perpetuating racist ideas is very much an intentional process. In one sense, when we either buy into racist ideas or unknowingly internalize them, it helps to maintain white supremacy that created the status quo and imbalanced power structure we know to be present in U.S. culture. Internalizing racism, sexism, classism, ableism allow us to justify experiences that we should call out as unjust. But we tend not to do that because we buy into the idea that people deserve what they get, or they deserve to be where they are in this society because of the color of their skin, or because of their perceived gender, or how much money that they have. Sometimes all three are in play, right? And so one of the things I used to say to I used to teach at a community college, and when we would talk about classism, I would say, even in the moment when you have a parent, let's say a parent has a child who's been cutting up in school, right, not doing their schoolwork, and the teacher called and they had to do a whole parent-teacher conference. And so the parent's idea of a lecture, and then this was, this was just what they thought, right, to be the most appropriate thing to say, is to take that child on a ride in a car and say, look, you see that bum on the street? You keep acting like this in class and not doing your schoolwork, and you're going to end up like that bum on the street. That's a thing that people do, right? We have these images and these ideas, and it's always to be better than the next person. It's always in contrast of something we consider to be bad or negative or hideous. That goes for gender, that goes for race, that goes for body image, you name it, right? And we internalize that. We internalize that type of thinking, right? And perpetuate that. And it's not that we mean to cause harm to others, but that's what we've been taught, right? The diagram is intended to get you started thinking about what you have been taught from your earliest memory of childhood. So if you can think back, right, to when you were really itty bitty little, like when did you first notice there was difference in terms between gender, right, and power, right? When did you first notice that? When did you notice it with race? When did you notice it with class or money, right? When did those moments come up for you as a young person? So with internalized racist oppression, it is first of all very near and dear to my heart. Like, I am definitely the person who I spent a lot of time growing up in a community where it was very common to have people talk about someone because their skin was dark. Very common to talk about their hair and call their hair nappy, right? Very common to talk about their nose or how they speak. Like that was a common thing for kids to tease each other about, for teachers to tell passing jokes about or laugh at what the kids talk about or what the students talked about, right? And so that's just one example, right? To the point where I made a commitment. I said, when I have kids, the word nappy will never be used in my house. It's just not, we not gonna talk like that. We're not gonna say things like ugly and dark skin and light skin and all this and that and all this crazy talk. We're going to instill beauty in everything that we do, right? And you'd be surprised how hard that is. Some of you may not be surprised, right? And I've had students, say to me, after we have these conversations, right, these very deliberate conversations about internalized racism, and sometimes it's hard for people to know, I don't know if I've experienced that. So we talk about it and we talk about it and we talk about it. But another example, and before I give the example, let me preface it by saying this. For people of color, it's about survivability. It always has been, right? And so something that was intended to, we thought was intended to help someone survive or have the ability to deal with adversity ended up being very harmful for a lot of folks, right? And so whether that was, don't you speak Spanish when you leave out this house? Because if you speak in Spanish, they're not gonna think you smart. They're not gonna think you belong. You're supposed to belong here. We're here to belong. Like, and that's important, right? For the parents who say that, that's about survivability. Absolutely. Fitting into a system that is presently harmful to people that do not fit the white norm, who do not fit into the mold of whiteness. And so for many folks of color, people make decisions every day about what it is that I need to do in order to be seen for who I have and the worth that I carry around me, or what I think the worth is. For some of us, we don't even know what our worth is because we've instilled all of these stereotypes about what beauty is, right? And what intellect is. And so we're emulating something that is not of who we are. Intersectionality is a major component of how we talk about race. And I want, when y'all have me talk, we did not talk about critical race theory today. And look, I got some notes downstairs and I'm trying to like text and talk to y'all at the same time. Like, could you bring me them notes off my, we did not, but when I speak, I'm going to speak from my experience as a Black woman. That's what you get, right? So really what I want you to do, and you can put it in the chat as well, or think about what you want to say in the dialogue session tomorrow. I really do want to hear and have you think about, what does this mean for you, right? This cycle. What have you been internalizing? What has been perpetuating in ways that are within your control and have been beyond your control? And how do we name that, and how do we sit with that and just see it for what it is, right? It's not about being good or bad or wrong or right. It's about recognizing here's the impact. Like, these are the consequences. Sometimes they're natural, sometimes they're not natural. But here's the consequence of what racial oppression looks like. Here's how it shows up, right? And so the intersectionality is a major component. And so while race is a common denominator, and that is always, that is something that we can always debate and talk about, it is also necessary to state that there are other aspects of our identity and who we are, right? Yesterday kicked off Pride Month, right? There are so many aspects of who we are that are invisible to people, right? That get discounted, that are underutilized in terms of our skill and our ability. And so I want to name, that's why I say, like, I know I tend to talk about my own lived experience, but I want to name the intersectionality of how these things sort of manifest for us, right? Again, internalized oppression can be defined as the devaluing of one's own identity, culture, according to societal norms. So you're taking a measurement stick and you're using that measurement stick that has been socially constructed and socially crafted to make decisions and make determinations about your own worth, right? And there are those of us who fight against that. And guess what? It's still hard. It's still hard to do. Even when we get into the space of talking about liberation, it's called liberation for a reason. It is not an easy thing to achieve. It never will be an easy thing to achieve. Because the fight that we have to have is going to be not only with our adversary, but with the very things that we think about and we have internalized from the time that we were itty bitty. All of us, right? It's a constant struggle to do. The last thing I want to say about this cycle, and usually when we do this slide, we're usually talking with people who are our coworkers, like they work in the same organization. And so we spend a lot of time talking about how this shows up in the workplace in terms of gatekeeping and, you know, tokenism and being made to feel like you're important, but maybe you're important because you're bilingual. You're important, but maybe you're important because you have lived experience that makes you provocative, and people like you can tell your story, and then the organization is benefiting from you being able to tell your story, right? So in these very like performative ways that end up being harmful for BIPOC folks. So if you're seeing some of that stuff on the slide, I just wanted to give you some context there. But one of my favorite people to study is W.E.B. Du Bois. And in his research, he did a lot of research, for those who may not be familiar with him. He was the person who, when slavery ended and slaves were just like told, okay, y'all free, he was the scholar that said, so what are they supposed to do with this new freedom? What is it that they're supposed to do? How are they supposed to find their way? What does that look like to be in bondage mentally and physically for so long, and then to be set free and have to figure it out? So he did a lot of his study around in the post-slavery era. And one of the things that he talked a lot about is this idea of double consciousness, right? And double consciousness plays out even in today's time for folks of color, right? It's this challenge of always looking at oneself through the eyes of white society, right? And so it creates this double experience, like who you are in mainstream society and then who you are amongst your own culture and your own people, and having to figure out how do you navigate that. And how do you work back and forth between those two worlds? And some people talk about it in very lightly, right? Like they'll use concepts like, yeah, we code switch, right? Or whatever that is, right? But part of being able to do that and live in two worlds is exhausting, because it still reinforces this idea that you're othered in some sort of way. Either you're othering yourself, or the experiences have created this sense of othering, right? And that doesn't feel good. Nobody wants to feel like the other. Oh yeah, you, right? And so just thinking about how this cycle can perpetuate harm, has perpetuated harm for us individually, for how we parent, for how we love, for all the different things that we do, right? And how it intersects with so many aspects of our identity that, quite honestly, is invisible to many folks. It's just important to sort of point that out. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Nia, because she's going to talk specifically about what whiteness looks like, right? And so I'm gonna hand it over to her, and then I'll come back and talk about how we break this cycle and what that looks like and what that could feel.
So here on this slide, we have how folks display willful ignorance. And, so folks use denial, minimalization, blame, lack of intent. It's over now, competing victimization. So with denial, it was similar to like what happened on January 6th. A lot of white folks were like, this isn't who we are. Oh my gosh, how could this happen? And it's like, yo, your neighbor is that person. Like, that's a cop from your neighborhood. That was the fire chief. That was an Air Force veteran who was right there in those acts of violence. at the Capitol that day. Minimization. Racism isn't a big problem anymore. It's not that bad. We had a Black president. And then we blame folks, oh, look at the way they act. If they spoke English, then maybe they wouldn't get treated like that. The lack of intent, it was only a joke. I didn't mean it like that. And then it's over now. Slavery was a long time ago, those things don't happen right now. When it's like, no, it's still happening, just in a different form, like was stated earlier, in the criminal justice system. Competing victimization. They're taking away our jobs. White folks are under attack. Oh my gosh, my country isn't patriotic because now we're celebrating Juneteenth and recognizing, or we have a Black vice president. I've heard that. And so next slide, please. And so we want to talk about the continuum of racism and how we are all somewhere on this continuum, and understand that white folks created racism and also get to choose whether they want to be anti-racist or racist, as well as white passing folks. And for, I know everybody was here last week. Well, mostly everybody was here last week, but I'm a biracial woman. So my mother is a Black woman and my father's white. And I didn't realize I was racially ambiguous until I left my community. And so within my lifetime, I realized there were certain spaces that folks assumed I was a white woman. And I didn't realize what that meant because I was told, oh, well, you trying to be Black. And it's like, hold up, my mother's Black. But I was, as I grew up, I realized, wow, people are racially ambiguous, and that there is that was a problem. Yeah, I recognize that. But then I also realized that there was a privilege to that. It was like, oh, okay, this is the way folks see me. So I may be able to operate differently. And it's a decision every day that I make when I wake up that I am dismantling white supremacy in the spaces I occupy in my mind, that I challenge the beliefs that were taught to me in school or even within my family because of the internalized racism that my family members have had, and then also teaching my children. And so on the continuum, so we want to talk about aspiring anti-racist, and not many white folks are in this space actively looking to address their individual contribution to systemic racism and working to make restorative and transformative change in themselves and the organizations that they're in. So that's like calling out, saying, like Kenya said earlier, if I'm a white person on the board and everyone's white, it's like, hold up, why is everybody white? And then, picking folks for their experiences and what they can bring to the table, not just because they are Black or Latinx. And then you have performative wokeness, where many white folks navigate this space. White folks operate in this sense of urgency for becoming anti-racist with no real understanding. And we kind of saw that last year with the protests and stuff. I remember, I can't remember his name right now, but it was a politician who was marching and, but yet he sat there and was at the Senate or the Congress, during this cycle and still passing racist laws and policies and supporting those oppressive policies. So it's like, okay, all you did was want to win that race in November, you know what I'm saying? And that's a problem. And so then you have subversive racists, which organizations that hide behind pseudoscience, religion, conservatism to promote racist beliefs and policies. And then folks that enforce supremacy, groups that use violence to enforce supremacy, the KKK, the Boogaloo, police, sheriffs, and the US military. And I don't know if I've expressed this, but I am a disabled veteran. And when I joined the military, I didn't realize that what the system I was joining was perpetuating racism. And it was enforcing white supremacy globally. And I was just trying to get out of poverty, not realizing that. So, and that's something that I personally, and even, I know Black folks in the military and Latinx folks that we contributed to white supremacy, unknowingly did that. So know that we can all be on this continuum of racism by perpetuating white supremacy in our own communities. A few examples of this is when our communities play into the idea of colorism and categorizing, like Kenya said, light-skinned folks as more attractive, or the idea of having good hair. Also telling children, don't stay in the sun too long because you don't want to get too dark. And also, I know growing up in a Black and Latinx community, there was, folks would say negra or negro, a negrita. And, in some cultures, it may be a compliment of some sort or endearment, but it's actually just calling folks, hey, Black, it can be offensive. But it's a cultural norm in some cultures. And so we have to acknowledge that the history of racism and white supremacy is rooted in some of our own personal beliefs, and we can perpetuate it unintentionally.
Thanks, Nia. Yeah, I'm gonna stay on my script because I don't want us to run out of time. I want us to have a chance to chat before we near the end. But the one thing I want to highlight for this slide is that there is, it is possible to reimagine a place where power has been redistributed and norms that we thought were so important to hold don't need to be the norms, right? But that doesn't come without a mental struggle, right? Like it's one thing to change the rules, it's another thing to change your mindset, and that having that cognitive dissonance, right? That moment where things that you have been taught and things that you have been shown that you have accepted no longer make sense, and it leaves you feeling conflicted and disconnected. In this instance, we want you to lean into that, right? We want you to lean into that discomfort of no longer having the answer because the answer wasn't quite the answer, right? And so being able to figure out, using cultural humility and a practice of cultural humility, how do I need to show up? How do I need to see you? What am I not seeing? What am I not hearing? Because I have all this noise playing in the background, noise that equals out to all the things that I've been taught and all the things that I've been shown. How do I start to mute and turn down that background noise and really just sit in this moment of discomfort and aspire to this moment of practicing cultural humility? Let's go to the next slide. So what I want you to do is just take 1 minute and think about, and you don't have to write it down. You just need to think about how have you been impacted by the cycle of racially oppressive systems and how it may show up in the work that you do. And I appreciate those of you who have been sharing in the chat. I mean, quite a few of you have shared your own personal stories of how you've been impacted by the cycle of racially oppressive systems. And I appreciate you all doing that and sharing that so that people can hear how relevant and how common these practices and these stories have been, right? For whatever reason, we have this common experience of having heard things and being taught things that were harmful as we look back and reflect. So just think about how you've been impacted if you haven't already thought about it, and how it may show up in the present work that you do. Because I guarantee you there is nobody working on the face of this earth who is not impacted by what they've experienced throughout the trajectory of their life, and that not be coming out in the work that you do, particularly if you're working with people. Okay, so I want to move forward to the racial justice framework, because even if we run up against time, I want to leave it on a promising, hopeful note, and not like a low note, right? So this is about being able to center a racial justice framework. But we had to walk through, right, all of the different ways in which what we're up against. Like, why is it so very important and so very necessary to have and move and operate by centering racial justice, right? And analysis, recognition, and skill is a part of that. So there are 3 components of the framework that we're introducing. And we created a racial equity toolkit that we'll share, and it has this information in the toolkit as well. And so again, the first piece, which we did a lot of in this 2-day workshop, was the recognition. It starts with the recognition. We have to name these things. And we've spent so much time being silent. And I know someone put in the chat, did we get a chance to talk about critical race theory? We did not, but the most important thing I want to name about critical race theory is that it is the opposite of silence. Because we have used silence for so many decades, just simply not talking about it. If we don't talk about it, we don't have to deal with it. And that is not how we move toward racial justice. And so that recognition is super important. The analysis is also important. So as you learn information, what are you doing with that information? How are you now using that as a lens to see and really understand how oppression works, and quite honestly, how liberation works, right? And so really understanding how dynamics play, the role of interpersonal dynamics and how it shows up in the way in which we talk to people and support one another, either through grant funding or through community organizing, all the different things that we do and we consider to be work. Are we wrapped up in, is institutional racism wrapped up in our practices? If it's not, how do we know it's not? In order for you to really uncover and be able to explicitly state, it's not present here. In fact, racial justice is present here. You have to have some aspect of an analysis to be able to detect where barriers are and where they are not. And then the skill of demonstrating and understanding your work, right? Being able to demonstrate that you can make space, show up, confront silence, invisibility, and engage in both critical self-reflection and vulnerability. The skill is more than just being performative. It's more than just hashtagging and showing up. And you know what? Protests are great. But that's one dimension of a multi-dimensional approach that is needed. You have to give of yourself emotionally. It is hard work. You can do it up here and you can have your fist like this, but if you don't have your heart open, we're not gonna get there. It's hard work at the end of the day. And so being able to be vulnerable, being able to be critically self-reflective is also both skills that are necessary to do this work. All right, Denisha, do you want to share about, let's just go to, I want to really be able to touch on the liberation and aspiring white ally piece, or maybe the liberation, and then we'll see where we are with time. And I know that that's something that you wanted to talk about, Denisha.
That's fine with me, either way.
All right, this is one of my favorite quotes, by the way, of Shirley Chisholm, who's the first Black woman to run for president. Just read that, right? I think we spoke to it quite a bit tonight, but I love this quote, and it's at the tag of all my emails, and so and that's real for me. Like, it's not just about rejecting what people think about us, but sometimes we're gonna have to reject the stereotypes that we have of ourselves. So with that, we can go to the next slide, and Denisha can take it from there.
Thank you. And I won't touch on it for too long due to time, but this is our process for liberation. As we mentioned at the beginning, during our community agreements, this is definitely a marathon and a journey, definitely not a sprint to achieve liberation. And this is also just to display how individuals can flow through this process. And that solely depends on their lived experiences. So this is not a generalization. This is not a saying that this is step by step, you will hit all these steps in this specific order or anything of that nature. This is just for us to understand the way in which we can navigate a way for us to free ourselves from racial oppression. And so the first one I'll touch on is not white. Many people will probably look at that and say, well, we know that, we're looking for and tell that, right? But for a lot of people, unconsciously and consciously, this is a fork in the road for them, right? This is deciding whether or not they want to assimilate to whiteness in order to thrive in America. And again, this could be conscious or unconscious, and it also can be a part of your cultural norms, as have been stated prior. Like, a lot of people who in their adulthood have to make that decision. And many people whose families have immigrated to America have to make that decision on whether to teach their kids the culture of their homeland or to require them to assimilate to whiteness in order to thrive and survive, as Kenya stated earlier. Just a quick example, I remember once I graduated, I decided to go natural. So cutting off all the perm in my hair and really just embracing the natural state of my hair. And my dad actually told me, he was like, well, you're graduating now, so you're gonna have to straighten your hair sometimes in order to thrive in a lot of these spaces, because those white folks not gonna be able to accept that natural hair. And I was like, well, they accept it or they don't. Either way, I'm gonna thrive regardless. And I just had to make a conscious decision. And again, that's that internalized oppression speaking down from generation to generation, that we have to assimilate to this culture of American beauty, quote unquote. But I decided to stand tall, and sometimes I will straighten my hair, but it's only because I want to. It's not because I'm trying to show up in the space. Majority of the spaces that I show up in, if it's majority of a white space, I intentionally choose to wear braids or wear my natural hair just to prove a point that I can thrive in these spaces as my natural being. But the next space is rage. As we learn more about our true history, like for part one, even for me, it brought up a lot of rage and anger in a sense. And we have to just realize that rage is in a sense, is a step toward empowerment, but it's not necessarily empowerment. It's more so of a reaction. And it can ignite us to do various things. And in these times, we want to ignite us to liberate ourselves. Yeah, so when you realize and come to realization that you were told lies in history courses in school and in our educational system, and ways that you have maybe possibly unconsciously contributed and perpetuated white supremacy and hate for yourself, as well as your community, it tends to ignite a lot of rage and anger. And so we just, which is a part of the stage and how we show up in these spaces when we start hearing these things. I know when the George Floyd situation happened, for me, that brought for a lot of rage, hence our Righteous Rage shirts, which you can probably see or not see that I have on right now. Just understanding that the rage is necessary, and we have to feel that. We have to sit in that uncomfort to then give us the knowledge and understanding of how we want to move forward. And we have to and liberate ourselves by immersing ourselves in the truth of our own history and our own shared experiences. And we also have to understand many ways that our communities of color have been pitted against each other in light of white supremacy and racism, and the struggle to achieve solidarity across cultural and ethnic groups in order to achieve liberation. And understanding what steps are necessary in achieving solidarity, and how we find it, and how do we even go by starting the conversation about how internalized oppression impacts me as a Black woman, and how it impacts the people that I work with in the community, and how it impacts other communities as well. But we have to build that in order to have collective action in how we combat racism and seek liberation. But at the end of it, liberation is not just about empowerment, but it's also claiming that power and charging and pushing against the norm. We have to reimagine, because it's hard for us to just say, oh, we can just deal away with racism. We actually, because it's so embedded in our systems, in our everyday lives, that we literally have to reimagine life without it, and then achieve it that way. We have to learn how to build solidarity. We have to learn how to move towards liberation that will benefit and help us all thrive in our own way, and have complete agency of how we show up and how we plan to show up moving forward.
Thanks, Denisha. I'm mindful of time, and what I want to do is have Nia sort of take us home, and because I want her to set up kind of what we can look forward to tomorrow, and tomorrow we'll have a little more time to talk about liberation, and also what it means for white folks and BIPOC to really commit to a racial justice framework. And like I said, we'll be sharing resources too. So much of what we talked about today and what we didn't get a chance to talk about will be in that toolkit. So I'll turn it over. Anna, if we can go to the last slide, I think it's slide 55. It's like 54, sorry. It's after the James Baldwin picture. So go again. And then one more time. There it is. And then we'll have Nia sort of give us a closing.
So thank you all today for your patience and your attention and your listening, and then being active in the chat and also within the unmute button, the group. So we'll have some growth work and so we have self-reflection. So tomorrow's dialogue will be about what thoughts, reactions, feelings, and comments you have after watching the cultural humility video. Is anyone able to put that in the chat real quick? Y'all should have got it in the email, and I know I put it in the chat last week. And then what practices or commitments can you make to center racial justice? And how can you ascribe to cultural humility as you do this work? So thank you all for sharing.